Hello and welcome to Global Poetry, live from my house in Fresno, California. I'm your host, Gary Soto. Today we'll be looking into the lives of renowned poets from across the world. Today's episode will focus on Oscar Wilde, myself, and Christopher Okigbo. We will be delving deep into the golden works of these poets and looking into their origins. Let's welcome our first guest, the Irish poet and my close friend, Oscar Wilde. Hope you're doing well, Oscar. I'd like to ask you a few questions about your life, if you don't mind.
No problem, Gary. So what do you want to know about me today?
So, Oscar, where are you from?
I hail from Dublin in the Republic of Ireland.
What was your childhood like?
I was surrounded by brilliant minds at birth, since my father was a surgeon and my mother was a nationalist supporter and also a poet. This led to a very bookish childhood for me. In the end, it made me focus on school from a young age. I attended Portora Royal School, Trinity College, and Oxford.
So how would you describe yourself?
I would describe myself as a person with very flamboyant personality who is positive in life. I love to share my poems with others and listening to other poets.
So what inspired you to become a poet?
Well, I guess that my parents, especially my mother, influenced me to become a poet. Secondly, when I attended the Portora Royal School, I fell in love with Greek and Roman studies. Finally, I attended Oxford in 1874, where I won my first place medal in a writing competition and began my overall career as a poet. In 1878, the year of my graduation, the poem Ravenna, which I wrote, won the Newdigate Prize for the Best English Verse by an Oxford undergraduate. This would begin a bright career for me.
So what influenced your poetry?
Well, after gaining a newfound interest in poetry, I traveled to America, where I met with people such as Oliver Wendell Holmes, Henry Ward Beecher, and Walt Whitman. Walt proclaimed that I was a great, splendid boy. Mr. Whitman influenced me to continue my journey with poetry. I can also say that my parents and my academic achievements influenced my poetry as well.
Can you describe your poetry for me?
I believe that my poetry describes experiences in my life. For example, when I was sentenced to 2 years of hard labor in prison, I wrote the Ballad of Reading Gaol and De Profundis. These two poems captured the harsh reality and self-reflection that came from my imprisonment. I believe that all poems should be influenced by one's experiences, and that is the best way to write poetry.
So what is one of your favorite pieces of poetry?
My favorite piece of poetry is My Voice, and obviously is written by me. I would like to present you all with this poem. I would have memorized my poem, but I have written 140 other poems, and after all, I am actually 161 years old. This is my voice. Within the restless, hurried modern world, we take our hearts full pleasure, you and I. And now the white sails of our ship are furled, and spent the lading of our argosy. Wherefore my cheeks before their time are wan, for very weeping in my gladness fled. Sorrow hath paled my lips vermilion, and ruin draws the curtains of my bed. But all this crowded my life has been to thee, no more than lyre or lute or subtle spell of voyals or the music of the sea that sleeps a mimic echo in the shell. Now I will analyze it for you. I intended for the poem to be like a kind of like a dialogue between a lover and myself. Whether the conversation was like based on what actually went on in my head, I think that is apparent that it's a version of events. In my voice, there are only 3 scenes, 3 stanzas, and they're written in 4-line stanzas using a very traditional rhyme scheme, ABAB, in the iambic pentameter. My poem sounds more strictly organized rather than emotionally as a result of the rigid metric scheme. As a final point, I want to look at the final stanza of my voice. This is where we observe that while the man in the poem is left wasted and ruined, the woman is free to move on with her life. The problems that have brought them to the point of parting are a dreamlike sort of noise that we can set aside and move away from. One can, after all, hear the ocean inside a shell, but one can also put the shell down and walk away from it.
This poem is now on my list of favorite poems. I have one final question. What legacy do you believe you left on the world?
I established myself as a leading example of artistic movement, a theory of art and literature that emphasized the pursuit of beauty for its own sake rather than to promote any political or social viewpoint. Thank you all for your kind applause.
I'd like to tell you a little bit about myself now. Please welcome my close friend, Christopher Okigbo, who will now be interviewing me.
So where are you from?
I was born right here in Fresno, California.
What was your childhood like?
My childhood was filled with difficulty at every corner. Since I was born, my family lived in barrios, which are poor Mexican neighborhoods in California. Both my grandparents and my parents had to work as laborers in the surrounding area to support my family. I lost my dad when I was just 5 years old, and that took a tremendous toll on me. I did not receive much encouragement to do well in school because of my family's dire financial situation. Despite this, I took an unusual liking to poetry.
How would you describe yourself?
I describe myself as a happy person who always focuses on the positive things in life. I consider myself very lucky to have made it all the way here, after starting out with so little.
What inspired you to become a poet?
I was inspired to become a poet after taking strange interest in the famous poems of poets such as Ernest Hemingway, John Steinbeck, Jules Verne, and Robert Frost. Despite my lack of focus in school, poetry stood out to me as a way of expressing myself through the use of carefully crafted words. I eventually went to Fresno City College and California State University, where I earned my degree in English. I later focused the rest of my education on poetry writing, and the rest was history.
What influenced your poetry?
My poetry was definitely heavily influenced by my childhood and the atmosphere I grew up in. I used real-life experiences growing up and used them as the basis of many of my poems. Many of the major themes in my poetry, such as the value of money, also stem from my childhood and my family's fragile financial condition. Another thing that has always been a part of me and my poetry is my culture. My Mexican heritage always shines in my poetry, and I take great pride in sharing my Mexican background.
What is one of your favorite pieces of poetry?
I'd have to say that one of my favorite pieces of poetry has to be one of my poems called How Things Work. If you don't mind, I would actually like to recite this for you, and then analyze it to give you a glimpse of the style of my poetry. How things work. Today, it's going to cost us $20 to live. 5 for a softball, 4 for a book. A handful of ones for coffee and 2 sweet rolls. Bus fare, rosing for your mother's violin, we're completing your task. The tip I left for the waitress filters down, like rain, wetting the new roots of a child. Perhaps a belligerent cat that won't let go of a ballad sock until there's chicken to eat. As far as I can tell, daughter, it works like this. You buy bread from a grocery, a bag of apples from a fruit stand, and what coins are passed on help others buy pencils, glue, ticket to a movie in which laughter is thrown into their faces. If we buy a goldfish, someone tries on a hat. If we buy crayons, someone walks home with a broom. A tip, a small purchase here and there, and things just keep going, I guess. In my poem, I included many literary devices to enhance the meaning of my poem. I vary my sentence lengths and structure throughout my 19 lines. In the poem, I describe a bunch of food items that people buy during the day. I added these details because when I was a young boy, I faced many situations where I did not have enough food to eat. The basic meaning of this poem is to show the value of money, which was something I had to learn at a very young age. Some literary devices that I have used include personification, similes, and hyperboles. I purposely emphasize the idea that nothing is free. My tone from the beginning is confident, which shows the reader that I am sure about what I am saying. That's all I have for you today.
What legacy do you believe you left on the world?
I feel like I've promoted awareness for poverty-stricken areas in California, while also bringing some recognition for the Mexican-American community in the United States. Most of all, I would want to be remembered for my work outside of poetry, especially my volunteer work with people who are less fortunate.
Stupendous. I would like to give you all a look into my life. Welcome back, Oscar Wilde, who will be asking me some questions.
So, Christopher, where are you from?
I hail from Ojoto, a state in eastern Nigeria.
What is your background?
My original aspirations were to become a doctor, but after much thought, I decided to begin studying Greek and Latin at the University of Ibadan. I participated in the Nigerian Civil War that began in 1967.
How did that affect your poetry?
My poetry was heavily influenced by the classics of Greece and Rome, along with modernist American and European styles, African tribal mythology, and my home country's rhythms. I spent my life tormenting over my country's social problems, and I tried conveying my visions through my poetry. I write in a melodic mode, using repetitions, rhythms of incantation, and words as if listening to and interpreting far-off sounds. My poetry is full of ellipses, with barely a poem not marked by sentences left to drop off from the three dots.
How would you describe yourself?
To my fans and to my critics, I'm known as the Poet with Destiny. I received the Langston Hughes Award for Poetry at the Festival of Negro Arts in Senegal, but I had to decline because I cannot accept an award based on racial judgment. Maybe you'll see why I won the award after I read my poem, Thunder Can Break. Fanfare of drums, wooden bells, iron chapter, and our dividing airs are gathered home. This day belongs to a miracle of thunder. Iron has carried the form with token gestures. Thunder has spoken, left no signatures. Broken barbicans alone tell one tale the winds scatter. Mountain or tower and slay, lo, your hostages. Iron has made, alas, masterpieces. Statuettes of legendary heroes. Iron birds held, fruit of flight, tight for barricaded in iron handiwork, a miracle cage. Bring them out, we say, bring them out faces and hands and feet. The stories behind the myth, the plot which the ritual enacts. Thunder can break, earth, bind me fast, obduracy, the disease of elephants.
What do you think you included in this poem?
I personified the thunder, specifically using the technique known as pathetic fallacy. I used my African roots to influence my work. This poem gives off a spiritual essence. At the end of my poem, I used one of my famous ellipses. Clearly, the motif for the poem is thunder. Thunder symbolizes the revolution occurring in Nigeria while I was writing this. This is an example of me using the conflict in my country to inspire my work. Thank you all for being so kind to me. I'll send you back to your host.
That's all we have today, folks. See you next week when we interview Maya Angelou, Emily Dickinson, and Sylvia Plath.